Okay, so we all love the Viking stuff, and honestly, they were really good at it. Like, better than some of us with modern tools, good. So today, we're going to talk about how the Vikings kept themselves and their livestock alive in a world where winter lasted forever and the grocery store was, well, still 1,000 years away. Now, picture this. It's early April in Scandinavia, the snow's just starting to melt, the ground's soggy as heck, and your entire family's survival depends on how fast you can wake the land back up. Welcome to Viking Spring, also known as the season of please let this year not suck. Here's the first thing to understand. Viking farmers didn't have time to ease into it. As soon as the frost let go of the earth, it was go time. We're talking oxen yoked up, fields being scratched open, and everyone, from grandma to toddler, pitching in. And yeah, I said scratched open, because Viking farmers didn't use deep digging plows like we do today. They used a tool called an ard, basically a wooden pole with an iron-tipped blade. It didn't dig into the soil so much as scrape it. Think of it like a rake's tougher, grumpier cousin. Perfect for the sandy, lighter soils of Scandinavia, but not exactly ripping through clay like a John Deere. This tool was usually pulled by oxen, not horses. Why? Because oxen were the Viking version of an all-wheel drive pickup truck. Slow, sturdy, and could plow and fertilize at the same time. That's right, instant manure application. Not glamorous, but effective. And speaking of fertilizing, Viking farmers were seriously ahead of their time. They knew their soil needed a boost, so they'd throw down everything from manure and ashes to fish guts. Yeah, basically, whatever smelled the worst and didn't kill the plants went straight back into the dirt. It's like composting, but metal. Now let's talk crops. You won't find kale or quinoa on a Viking menu. These folks were growing barley, rye, and oats. Why? Because those grains are tough, just like the people growing them. They germinate quickly, survive short summers, and store well. Plus, barley gave them beer. And if you've ever survived a Viking winter, you deserve a beer. Everything was planted by hand. No fancy seed drills or GPS-guided machines. It was labor-intensive and relied entirely on the farmer's skill and experience. And they didn't just throw down seeds randomly. They saved the best grain from the previous harvest as seed stock. Clean, dry, and carefully guarded over winter. That was their insurance policy. Planting it wrong or late could mean no food by next winter. No pressure, right? Let's also give a shout out to flax, which they planted not for food, but to make linen. Because even Viking warriors needed underwear, folks. And don't forget the teamwork. Viking farming wasn't a one-man show. Entire households, sometimes neighbors too, worked together to beat the planting window. Friar, or whichever god they thought could control the weather that week. So yeah, next time your Wi-Fi goes down or your Uber Eats is late, just remember, Viking farmers had to guess when the last frost would hit, plant an entire season's worth of food by hand, and hope that a surprise hailstorm didn't wipe it all out. All without weather apps. Hardcore. Alright, it's summer in Viking land. But before you imagine some chill beach vibes, let me stop you right there. There's no vacation in summer, no hammocks, no mojitos. Summer was work mode for Viking farmers because this was the only chance they had to make sure all that spring planting didn't go to waste. Viking summer was like that frantic final stretch of a group project, except if you failed, everyone might actually starve. Let's start with the daily grind. First off, weeding. Yeah, Vikings weeded their fields by hand every single day. Because if you let thistles, nettles, or wild oats take over your grain field, you're basically feeding the weeds while your real crops go hungry. No herbicides, no spray rigs, just hands, patience, and a bad back. By age 25. Also, summer meant constant crop checks. Vikings didn't have soil sensors or drones flying overhead. They used eyeballs, weather watching skills, and a lot of gut instinct. Too much rain? Could rot the roots. Too little? Say goodbye to those precious barley heads. And speaking of barley, this was one of their star crops. It could be used for bread, porridge, animal feed, and most importantly, ale. That's right, summer wasn't just about survival, it was also about brewing for the long winter. Because if you're snowed in for 6 months, you want to have something to take the edge off. Now here's a cool twist. Vikings weren't just farmers, they were also beekeepers. Yep, beekeeping in Scandinavia. They built simple log hives and kept bees mainly for wax, candles, and sealing containers, but also for honey, which was one of the few sweet things they had. No sugar, no syrup, just raw honey. And it wasn't just for tea, it was used to make mead, the Viking version of wine, which, let's be honest, sounds like something you'd absolutely want after spending all day pulling weeds and chasing goats. And yep, goats and sheep were part of the summer circus too. They were usually let out to graze, but someone had to watch them or they'd wander into the crops and eat everything. So guess who got that job? You guessed it, The kids. Viking summer break was basically glorified goat sitting. Instead of iPads, they had slings and sticks. Still fun, just a little more bitey. And let's not forget kitchen gardens. Around the longhouse, families grew cabbage, leeks, onions, and herbs like dill, lovage, and parsley. These were the MVPs of flavor and made all the bland stuff, like boiled oats, suck slightly less. Oh, and here's something most people don't think about: crop rotation. Vikings knew better than to plant the same thing in the same spot every year. They rotated fields to avoid wearing out the soil. Some years they even left a field fallow, aka let it nap, so it could recover nutrients. That's some regenerative agriculture 1,000 years before it became a TED Talk. So yeah, summer was nonstop. From dawn to dusk, it was inspect, weed, repair fences, herd goats, feed animals, and try to keep everything alive. And no, they didn't have bug spray, tough skin, and maybe a little pine tar. But the upside? This was the season of growth and hope. Every tall stalk of rye or fat cabbage head was a win. Every honeycomb pulled from the hive was a reason to smile. And if you survived the summer without your goats eating the entire garden, you were doing pretty great by Viking standards. So next time you kill a houseplant, just remember, a Viking mom was probably out there harvesting leeks, making cheese, stopping her toddler from stabbing himself with a pitchfork, and keeping wolves away from the sheep, all before lunch. Superwoman in a tunic. All right, here we go. Viking autumn. The stakes? All or nothing. You either harvest everything before the frost hits, or winter eats you alive. This wasn't some cozy, pumpkin-scented fall vibes scenario. No scarves, no pumpkin spice mead, just non-stop, full-throttle labor. Because your entire year's survival came down to a few frantic weeks. First up, the harvest. This was a no excuses, drop everything moment. Everyone, and I mean everyone, was in the field. You had folks swinging sickles and scythes like they were mowing down enemies, but instead of blood, it was barley flying everywhere. And because timing was everything, you couldn't afford to wait. Leave grain in the field too long, early frost or a surprise storm could wipe out months of hard work. No tractors, no silos, no plan B. Once the stalks were cut, next came threshing, the medieval version of shaking loose all the edible parts from the plant. And how did they do it? With flails, basically wooden nunchucks for grain. You'd lay out the grain on a hard surface, a stone floor, or packed dirt, then beat it until the seeds came free. Crunchy, satisfying, and probably a great workout. But they weren't done yet. After that came winnowing, where you toss the threshed grain into the air and let the wind blow away the chaff, the inedible husks. If there wasn't enough wind, you made your own with baskets or large fans. Honestly, it was like nature's version of a food processor. Now that you've got clean grain, you can't just leave it sitting around like a sack of potatoes. Because if moisture got in, boom, mold, rot, or a rodent buffet. So what did the Vikings do? Storage ingenuity, baby. They sealed grain in clay pots, wooden barrels, or underground pits, often lined with straw, ash, or even birch bark to keep out moisture. Some even built raised granaries, small wooden huts on stilts with airflow underneath to dry out the grain. No refrigeration, no vacuum seals, just smart design and constant checking. And that was just the grain. Don't forget the root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips. These were the winter MVPs. They were buried in earth cellars, basically natural fridges dug into the ground that stayed cool and dark. The Vikings layered the veggies with straw or sand to keep them from freezing or rotting. Also meat. Oh yeah, lots of that. They didn't just eat fresh meat whenever they wanted, no freezer, remember? Instead, they preserved it through smoking, salting, and drying. Fish was hung on drying racks near the coast. Pork and mutton were packed in salt and stored in cool rooms. And smoked sausages? Total winter lifesavers. And then there were the fermented goods. Cabbage became early versions of sauerkraut. Milk turned into cheese. Barley brewed into ale. If it could ferment, they fermented it. Honestly, they were kombuchaing before it was cool. But here's the wildest part. They didn't just store food for themselves, they had to make sure their livestock had enough too. Hay was harvested and stored in stacks or barns for cows, sheep, and goats to eat during winter. And if the hay ran out, you had to start thinking the unthinkable. Which animal gets eaten next? So yeah, autumn for the Vikings was like a month-long episode of Chopped Survival Edition. You had to gather everything, preserve it, protect it from bugs, mold, and weather, and calculate whether it would last through the long, cold void of a Norse winter. Next time you're annoyed that your fridge has too much kale and no snacks, just remember, Viking families had to inventory every single piece of food they had. No Instacart, no drive-thru. Just strategy, smoke, salt, and sheer willpower. Okay, so picture this. It's December in Viking-era Norway. It's dark. It's cold. The wind sounds like a wolf howling outside your window. And the sun? Yeah, it barely shows up. You might get like 4 hours of daylight if the sky's not full of clouds. Welcome to Norse Winter Survival Edition. This wasn't the season of sledding and snowmen. This was the season of, I hope we stored enough onions or someone's losing a goat. Let's talk about housing first. Viking longhouses weren't cozy by modern standards, but they were built for survival. The walls, thick layers of wood, turf, and mud, like nature's insulation sandwich. The roof, steep and thatched to let snow slide off. And the fire? Always burning, always. But here's the wild part. Some longhouses had animals living inside, that's right. Half human, half cow apartment layout. They'd bring in the sheep, goats, or even cows at night. Why? Because the animal's body heat literally helped keep the house warm. Say what you want about Viking home design, but that's some top-tier energy efficiency. Yeah, it probably smelled like a petting zoo mixed with campfire, but you didn't freeze, and that's what counted. Now let's talk food, because let's be honest, survival's all about the pantry. The good news? If you did your autumn right, you'd have barrels of grain, dried fish, smoked meats, and root vegetables ready to go. The bad news? That stuff had to last you until, like, May. So meals were simple. Porridge, flatbread, turnips, salted meat, and whatever pickled or fermented odds and ends you had. Think of it like a keto diet, just without the choice or the bacon-wrapped dates. And here's a grim little bonus. Fresh food was gone. You couldn't just pop outside and grab some herbs. You might have some dried dill or lovage stashed in a pouch, but for the most part, flavor was optional. On a good day, you may had some mead or ale brewed from leftover barley. It didn't warm your body, but hey, it warmed your soul and maybe numbed the frostbite. Now let's talk about chores, because winter didn't mean rest. Nope, you were still working constantly, just indoors. Vikings used this time to repair tools, carve new ones, spin wool, weave cloth, and sharpen weapons. Because once spring hit, it was game on again. And let's not forget about the animals. They needed feeding, watering, and cleaning, even if they were living under the same roof. Remember all that hay you stockpiled in the summer? This is where it paid off. If you ran out early, well, guess who's not making it to spring? Now here's a side you might not think about, the emotional toll. Winter isolation was real. No travel, no farming, no community events. You were stuck indoors with your family for months, rationing food and praying for mild weather. Cabin fever? Try Viking longhouse fever. That's why storytelling was so important. Elders would gather the kids and spin tales of gods, giants, and past battles. It kept spirits up and passed on the culture. It was also the Viking version of Disney Plus, except with more blood and less copyright. And if you had livestock, enough food, and didn't get snowed in so badly that you couldn't dig out the door, you were doing great. For the Vikings, winter was less about living large and more about just living. So yeah, next time your power goes out for 2 hours and you're freaking out because your frozen pizza is thawing, hey, just remember, a Viking family once survived 4 months on turnips, flatbread, and smoked goat in the dark, with animals sleeping in the hallway. And you know what? They made it through. All right, let's talk Viking farming tech. And by tech, I mean a stick, a rock, and whatever you could convince a blacksmith to bang into shape. The Vikings weren't exactly building robotic harvesters, but here's the thing, they didn't need to. They had tools so well suited to their environment, they got the job done with minimal resources and maximum durability. I mean, who needs a tractor when you've got an ox, a wooden plow, and sheer willpower? First up, the essentials. Hoes, rakes, pitchforks, scythes, spades, all made from wood, iron, and bone. That's right, bone. Vikings used everything. Your plow handle might be ash wood, but the blade? Forged iron, beaten by your local blacksmith, who probably also made your sword and your soup ladle. And let's not pretend these tools were single use. They were passed down, sharpened, patched, and repaired. Vikings didn't toss stuff out just because it had a crack. They fixed it with leather bindings, carved pegs, or sheer determination. Basically, the Viking version of duct tape. Let's get into the dirt, literally. Because the Vikings were early adopters of one of farming's least glamorous but most powerful secrets, manure. Yep, cow poop, sheep poop, even human waste in some cases. If it smelled bad and came out of a living creature, it was fertilizer. And it worked. Vikings knew that without putting nutrients back into the soil, the land would just give up. So instead of chemical fertilizers, they went full organic. The original compost kings. Got leftover fish heads? Toss them in the field. Burned wood? Ash goes into the compost. Leftover soup bones? Yep, dig a hole and let them cook in the soil. It was disgusting, but it worked. And you know what? Your modern garden could learn a thing or two from this. Here's the cool part. Viking farms were closed-loop systems long before sustainability became a trend. Everything was reused. Waste became fuel. Leftovers became feed. Even tools that broke were reforged or recycled into something else. It was the ultimate survival mindset. Make everything last, and if it doesn't, make it into something new. And let's not forget the role of animals in all this. They weren't just there for milk or meat. They were mini composting machines on legs. What they ate became what you used to fertilize what you planted to grow what you ate again. You see where I'm going with this. Look, Viking innovation wasn't about inventing new tech every 5 minutes. It was about making the simple things better and adapting to the brutal world around them. They even figured out field rotation, not because someone told them about soil nutrients, but because they saw what happened when they overused one patch of land. You plant barley here one year, move to the next field, the next. Let the animals graze in the old spot, and boom, natural fertilization. And while we're at it, some Viking communities even built basic irrigation systems. Ditches carved into sloped terrain to channel runoff toward crops. No pipes, no pumps, just gravity, guts, and Viking know-how. So yeah, Viking tools weren't flashy, but they were built to last, easy to fix, and perfect for the land. They made their own gear, fertilized their own fields, and reused absolutely everything. Basically, they were low-tech geniuses with a serious use-what-you-have attitude. Modern farmers may have sensors, apps, and autonomous tractors, but let's be real. If you dropped a Viking farmer into a homestead today with just an axe and a pile of junk, they'd probably still outgrow your backyard tomatoes. Give that man a shovel and he'll feed a village. Okay, so we've covered dirt, tools, snow, and poop. Now it's time for the stars of the Viking survival game, the animals, aka the original walking refrigerators. Vikings didn't just raise livestock because cows are cute. They did it because animals were basically multi-tools with hooves. Think of each one as a personal supply chain. Food, clothing, fuel, fertilizer, all wrapped in fur and attitude. Let's start with the big ones, cattle. Cows were priceless. They gave milk, which became butter, cheese, and something sort of like yogurt. That meant protein and fat in winter. A huge deal when your carbs were just flatbread and hope. And in many Norse communities, cattle were currency. Owning a few healthy cows? That meant you were somebody. Viking tax records? Yes, they had those. Literally counted wealth in livestock. Next up, goats and sheep, the scrappy survivors. Goats gave milk too, tangy, but still good. And both animals provided wool, meat, and fertilizer. If you were a smaller farm or couldn't afford cattle, these guys were your go-to. And Vikings didn't waste time naming them. These were working animals. Although, let's be honest, there was probably a goat named Stinky somewhere. Now, if there's one animal the Vikings loved eating, it was the pig. These guys were living compost bins. Feed them your kitchen scraps and they turn it into bacon. It's science. Pigs didn't need pasture, they grew fast, and when the time came, you got meat, fat, and even bristles for brushes. Viking charcuterie? Salted pork, smoked sausage, and lard for frying flatbread. And let's not forget the chickens, the snack dispensers of the Viking Age. Eggs were seasonal, more in spring and summer, and super valuable. They were eaten fresh, boiled, baked into barley flatcakes, and probably argued over at breakfast. Plus, chickens helped clean up insect pests and old, nasty leftovers. Now that we've met the cast, let's talk about the Viking menu, and spoiler alert, it changed with the seasons. In spring and summer, you had fresh milk, eggs, greens, maybe a little meat if a goat got unlucky. In autumn, you gorged, harvest meals, preserved fish, roasted pork. And in winter, you lived off stored grain, salted meats, root vegetables, cheese, and whatever you could stretch until spring. No takeout, no vending machines, just rationing and gut instinct. And like everything else in Viking life, nothing was wasted. Blood was used for pudding, bones used in soup or for tools. Fat was for cooking or waterproofing boots. Even intestines were turned into sausage casings or fishing lines. These people lived by the philosophy, if it's part of the animal, we're using it. Honestly, that's more sustainable than half the green startups out there. So yeah, Viking animals weren't just livestock, they were lifelines. Milk, wool, meat, heat, and more. Every grunt, bleat, and cluck was part of a bigger system, one that kept entire families alive through storms, famine, and some of the harshest weather on Earth. And next time someone says farm to table, just smile and say, cool. Vikings were doing that in 862 AD. with goats. They were mastering the art of survival farming long before tractors or grocery stores. They worked with the seasons, fed their families, and out-farmed most of us with nothing but wooden tools, smart timing, and a little help from the gods. Next time you kill a houseplant, just remember, some guy in 900 AD was out here growing barley in the middle of Norway with an ox, a stick, and sheer willpower. If this journey through Viking farming gave you a whole new respect for the people behind the plow, don't let it end here. Like the video if you learned something new. Subscribe to follow more untold stories of Norse life, beyond the battlefield into the heart of the home. And drop a comment. Would you survive a Viking winter on flatbread and turnips? From ancient longhouses to forgotten fields, the saga continues, right here with Chronicles of the Norse.